We have passed the halfway mark on our Lenten time in the wilderness. The Sunday after next is Palm Sunday, which means that Easter is just 3 Sundays down the road. We've been thinking of the wilderness as a place of solitude, a place of challenge, and a place where nature and our lives become integrated. And we have wondered at the work of God's Spirit when we are in the midst of our wilderness experience. We looked at the 40-day struggle, how we have taken Jesus' time of temptation in the wilderness and made it a Lenten time for us to reflect on our lives and our relationship with God and Jesus Christ. Last week, we thought about how some consequences are negative and others are positive. And in thinking about the woman at the well, how some failures turn around and become moments of wondrous success. This morning, we once again heard the story of the man who was born blind, who, when his sight was restored, faced challenges to his veracity, his integrity, and his understanding of the ways of God. One might wonder how sight, being able to see, could be a wilderness place, a place of solitude, of challenge, a place of integration with nature. Surely being able to see is a good thing. But when we focus our eyes, our energy, our emotions on that which is unholy, then, as in Jesus' metaphoric words, if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out and throw it away. In the world of John's narrative storytelling, we hear the longest story about Jesus' life and ministry, and how it played out in the world then and how it can play out in our world now. Jesus encounters a man who was born blind. He doesn't even ask him if he wants to be healed, and the man doesn't ask Jesus to heal him. It's the disciples pointing at the man that asked the question that they think will have a simple answer, but a question that instead makes them participate in a virtual parable. Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Like most everybody who lived in the time of the disciples of Jesus, there was a natural assumption that one's state in life was related to sin. If you were successful, you must be righteous. If you are not, you must be a sinner. Or you must be the consequence of someone else's sin. So the question of fault in relationship to this man's blindness is not surprising. And Jesus' answer must have been as shocking then as it is today. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. He was born blind so that God's works might be revealed in him. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think I have ever been in a situation where I have been intended to show God's work. And if my story were to end up like this man's story, I'm not certain I'd like to have anything to do with that. You see, the problem this man had after receiving his sight seems to me to be much more challenging than living with the blindness that he had spent his life getting used to. Now he faces an identity crisis. He knew who he was before. But now after, before he knew he was a beggar. He knew that his place was on the side of the road. But now his situation in life has changed. He was willing to humble himself and recognize that he was dependent upon the largesse of others. And then Jesus comes along, and as he always does, he turns the world upside down. Who would have thought that this man's gift of sight would cause such an uproar? And who would have thought that this man would shake the Pharisees to their core? It seems to me that all of us have blind spots in our lives, places where we can't see, and that only become an issue when someone else looks into that blind spot and challenges our blindness. If there is but one question I would like us to consider this morning, it is this: are we willing to concede that we have blind spots? And if we are willing to make that concession, how do these blind spots affect us, affect our families, affect our friends, our colleagues, our place in this world? While the story wraps itself around a man born blind, the question of blindness in this story is how rigid is the Pharisees' blind spot? Can they see their blind spot and change? In other words, what was the fallout of the Pharisees' Sabbath blind spot? As religious leaders, they felt responsible for the faith of their people. The people needed to hear their teaching and obey their teaching. And their understanding of the Sabbath, their blind spot about the Sabbath, was about to be exposed by one who had been blind all his life, but now could see. But before we encounter the blindness of the Pharisees, we hear the blindness of this man's friends and neighbors. They could only imagine. They could only see this person in one way: blind. He'd become such a fixture, sitting there begging that no one ever paid him any attention. They had accepted him for what he was, and when he was no longer what they expected, they didn't recognize him. They couldn't accept him for what he'd become. It was on Christmas Eve. We had finished opening our presents that I decided to tell my family that I was going to seek ordination as a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, I thought they'd be excited. I thought they would congratulate me, but they didn't. John the preacher didn't fit into their blind spot that was their understanding of who could be a minister and who could not. And Brother John was a definite not. They understood that one of the qualifications that was necessary in order for one to be a minister was, as is recorded in 1 Timothy 3:12. To be a minister, one must be the husband of one wife. And I didn't meet Jennifer for 15 more years. Ergo, I could not be a minister. And I know that it brings smiles onto people's face, but it broke my heart. Christmas Eve. Christmas Eve, 1991. We should not be surprised that when the blind man appeared before the Pharisees and was questioned about the one who gave him sight, that person, the healer, didn't fit their definition of a healer sent from God. If Jesus was sent from God, he would have known better than to heal on the Sabbath, for healing was not allowed on the Sabbath. Therefore, ergo, Jesus must have been sent from Satan. So not only did the blind man have to convince his neighbors and the Pharisees that he indeed was that man that was born blind, but he had to convince them that Jesus was sent from God. He had no plans on taking that on this morning when he got up. He had to convince them that Jesus was sent from God or be thrown out of the synagogue, excommunicated. And in sharing his compelling story and argument, he ended up losing his place in the world. When he was blind, he had a place. And now that he can see, there is no place. He was shunned, and no one would see him anymore. There is one thing that I do know, that though I was blind, now I see. Have you considered that you might have a blind spot or two? That you have certain expectations of people that unless met, you will have nothing to do with them, keeping them out of your circle of family and friends? Sometimes I think we actually know what our blind spots are, and we use them as protection because we know that if we deal with that blind spot, if we open our inner eye to see it, that we will have to change to live with it. We all tend to see things not as they are, but as we are. We like our world just as it is. We don't want to see the poverty down the street or around the globe. We don't want to see the young girls and boys forced into prostitution in order to keep themselves and their families alive. We don't want to see the neighbor down the street making meth in their home, and we certainly don't want to be the one to inform the police. We don't want to check up on our children's use of the internet, wanting to give them space, show them our trust, but knowing that they are never more than one click away from pornography or unhealthy chat rooms. We wear our blinders for protection because there is fear. The blind man's parents were afraid to stand up to the Pharisees. The young man's parents were afraid to stand tall for their son. They thought if they crossed the leaders that they too might be put out of the synagogue, that they could not see their life without participation in the synagogue. The fear of being ostracized, the fear of being criticized, the fear of being condemned, the fear of rejection. Finally, when one comes face to face with a blind spot, most often pointed out by someone we love and we trust, we often respond with belligerence. The Pharisees shouted, "You were born completely in sin. How dare you try to teach us?" It's the language of self-preservation, of maintaining the status quo, the kind of language that keeps us apart rather than bringing us together. It is the language of arrogance and judgment. It is the language of blindness. It is the language of a narrow God. I know you have heard it before, that John Newton, the captain of a slave ship that sailed out of Liverpool, picking up a cargo of slaves on the west coast of Africa and selling them in America, that very John Newton is also the author of the hymn Amazing Grace. I'm almost certain that when he told his friends and family that he had seen the error of his ways and was going to seek ordination, they scoffed at him, saying a slave trader could never be a minister. But they were wrong. You see, they could see, but were blind, whereas he was blind and now could see. I'm going to ask Bob to open his hymnal. Wait a minute, Marion. I'm going to ask Bob to open his hymnal. I'm going to ask the rest of us to stand and sing with our eyes closed and our hearts lifted up. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me.